There was a time when the name Philip K. Dick was once synonymous with only science fiction literature. But then the early 1980s and the release of Ridley Scott's seminal movie, Blade Runner, began to change things. Such a cinematic event would become the inception point for Dick to become one of the most adapted science fiction authors of all time. An interesting development, especially when considering the slow, cerebral, and often non-cinematic nature of his work. Still, regardless, the adaptations would keep coming, with over 20 now having been produced across film and television, some of which have had sequels and remakes of their own. But such interpretations would vary wildly when comparing them to their base texts, with some sticking more to the source material and others diverging wildly from it. Many would argue that such changes were necessary with certain stories, especially given Dick's style of writing and known disdain for anything commercial, a fact that held particular truth when it came to Hollywood. But the sad fact is, Philip K. Dick had died even before the first of the cinematic adaptations of his work had ever been released. And while Blade Runner remains a vastly changed interpretation of its base text, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, it would perhaps sound the klaxon for many an up-and-coming filmmaker to attempt to create their own masterpieces from such lofty, often disparate, and definitely cerebral stories, brimming with social commentaries, societal reflection, and philosophical questions. One such adaptation would be the masterfully crafted 1990 classic, Total Recall, an adaptation from one of Dick's short stories titled We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wasn't that a throwaway Arnie action movie by the guy who made Showgirls? And the answer is, kind of. But much like director Paul Verhoeven's other movies of this era, there is so much more going on in Total Recall than explosions and one-liners, even though it has those too.
Enjoyed the ride.
You got a lot of nerve showing your face around here, Hauser.
Look who's talking.
Sweetheart, be reasonable. After all, we're married.
Consider that a divorce. It's about goddamn time. Bullshit.
So, why not stay a while and let me try and show you the brilliance of this science fiction masterpiece, and also attempt to analyse and interpret its story, its themes, its successes, and its failures in the channel's first foray into the wacky world of movie analysis. Hope it's not shit! So, let's talk about Paul Verhoeven. Born in 1938 in Amsterdam, Verhoeven would begin his career in the early 1970s with films like Business is Business in 1971 and Soldier of Orange in 1977. However, it wouldn't be until he released his first fully American-funded movie in 1987 that he would begin to cement his legacy with more mainstream audiences, and also produce one of the greatest movie posters in cinematic history. I mean, look at it. Look at this. Wait, hang on. Let's do a little experiment. Let's compare this to the 2014 RoboCop remake poster. Okay, this is the original, and this is the remake. Oh. I mean, I guess. Underscore crime has a new enemy. Ugh. RoboCop tells the story of Alex Murphy, a cop who patrols the streets of a near-future dystopian version of Detroit, Michigan. On the verge of collapsing into complete anarchy through high crime rates and financial woes, the city of Detroit signs a deal with a mega-corporation named OCP, who are tasked with the creation and implementation of new crime-fighting technologies, and are also planning the creation of a new utopia named Delta City, which is to be built in place of much of Detroit's most run-down areas. But in reality, honourable gentrification and the creation of life-saving, peacekeeping tech is low on the agenda for OCP, which exists as the archetypal corrupt capitalist corporation, filled with cutthroat businessmen out for number one, and corner-cutting plans designed to spin good PR and make profit. While such a description doesn't come close to doing RoboCop justice, especially given the omission of its many other themes, it at least allows for the identification of two major elements that can also be seen in Total Recall: the satire and social commentary on 1980s America, and the use of extreme violence to reinforce its themes. RoboCop is a much more complex movie than it initially appears, and balances genuinely poignant thematic content with over-the-top violence and action perfectly. It successfully manages to exist as an excellent action movie of the era, and a clear commentary on the corporate greed which began to become rife at the time in the United States. Even more surprising was that these two seemingly disparate elements actually complemented one another and helped to reinforce the movie's central messaging and themes. Moreover, such wizardry was not a fluke, and Verhoeven would go on to repeat this amazing feat several times in both the movie we're really here to talk about, 1990's Total Recall, but also in his 1997 movie Starship Troopers, which would somehow arguably tackle even bigger themes, including military intervention and a society of world policing mixed with a perceived inherent American narcissism. Moreover, he would manage to do this whilst making the characters and action even more disposable as part of the movie's thesis statement. I guess what I'm getting at is that taken together, these three movies comprise a satire trilogy of sorts, with all three dissecting elements of United States culture through the utilization of mature content and a science fiction backdrop. Such a use of the medium is masterful and utilizes one of the best elements of the genre, social commentary through societal reflection, to its best degree. But it is Total Recall which really tackles the theme of the individual within such societies, and also the notion of the self in a contemporary world. Such deep philosophical commentary is not what you'd expect to find in a Schwarzenegger movie from 1990 with a triple-breasted prostitute, a weird creature living inside the bad guy from Twins, and a scene where Michael Ironside gets both his arms cut off by a freight elevator. Okay, so while it might sell itself like a mindless action movie, Total Recall is actually pretty complex, both thematically and from a narrative standpoint. In an attempt to try and combat such challenges, I've decided to break this video down into several sections in order to make it easier to digest, but who knows if that'll work. I'm already in uncharted territory here. Oh god, what if no one cares about my opinions on... Anyway, it makes sense that before we talk about Total Recall's themes, techniques, meanings and deeper mysteries, it's first best to briefly go over the literal events of the story as the viewer sees them. Our story begins in 2084. Douglas Quaid, a construction worker and all-round unfulfilled adult, is having recurring, vivid dreams about Mars, many of which seem to also involve a mysterious woman. At this point, Mars has in fact already been colonized and is ruled over by a man named Vilos Cohagen. He looks familiar. Through various news reports and other means, it is also established that Cohagen is in fact facing an uprising from many of Mars's unhappy and mutated inhabitants, but more on that later. Quaid's obsession with Mars continues to grow, and while his wife, Laurie, attempts to dissuade him, he feels drawn to the red planet for reasons he can't explain. Realizing that a trip to Mars is out of his price range, and also not an idea that Laurie would ever be on board with, Quaid instead decides to visit a company named Recall, a corporation that essentially sells the memories of various experiences for only a fraction of the price of actually doing them.
Have you always wanted to climb the mountains of Mars? But now you're over the hill? Then come to Recall Incorporated, where you can buy the memory of your ideal vacation cheaper, safer, and better than the real thing. So don't let life pass you by. Call Recall for the memory of a lifetime.
For the memory of a lifetime, recall, recall, recall.
While both Laurie and Quaid's friend, Dollar Store Danny DeVito,
Recall!
both try and tell him that it's not the best idea, Quaid goes anyway, hell-bent on tricking himself into thinking that he's been to Mars and no doubt partaken in wacky adventures while there. At his consultation, even the dude who works for Recall tries to tell him that Mars is a lame choice, but Quaid is nonetheless resolute.
I'm not interested in Saturn. I said Mars.
And so, after some used car salesman-like schmoozing, he eventually opts for the so-called secret agent package, an optional extra which also adds a further narrative to the customer's memories, making them believe that they are in fact a secret agent who liberates the planet from an evil oppressor and also wins the heart of a beautiful companion. Attracted to the thrill of such a set of memories, Quaid agrees to the predatory microtransactions and is immediately given a sedative. As he begins to lose consciousness and the staff busily begins setting up around him, he is asked to answer several questions regarding what he believes to be his perfect mate. Through answering honestly, the partner that is generated bears a striking resemblance to the woman who he'd been dreaming about. Things are getting a little weird now, right? Also, as innocuous as it may appear when compared to other sequences in the movie, I think this might actually be the most important scene in Verhoeven's Total Recall, but I'll come back to why that is later on. Not long after attempting the procedure, it's clear that something has gone very wrong with Quaid, and he begins violently trying to escape the procedure room whilst shouting random phrases which initially seem to relate to the package of memories that he's purchased. However, when this theory is presented to the doctor who is operating on him, she says that's impossible because she hasn't even implanted them yet. As it becomes clear that someone has already messed around with Quaid's memories, Recall decides to simply wipe his memory of the visit and send him home in a cab, hoping that they can avoid any fallout from the incident. Sure enough, Quaid awakens with no memory of how he came to be in a taxi with an animatronic of the Doctor from Star Trek Voyager, or even the last few hours of his life. Upon arriving home, he is met in the car park by his friend, low-rent Danny DeVito, who asks him how his trip to Recall went. Quaid, confused by the question, asks, "What trip?" Not Danny DeVito then tells him that he went to Recall despite being told not to, in order to get a set of Mars memories. Quaid attempts to leave and go home, but a bunch of non-DeVito cronies grab him and take him to a secluded area of the car park. Struggling, he asks what the hell is going on and what he is supposed to have done.
What the fuck did I do wrong?
But Dollar Store DeVito responds by accusing him of blabbing about Mars. In one last plea, Quaid tries to tell Not DeVito that he's made a mistake and that he must have him confused with someone else. Interestingly, low-rent Danny DeVito responds by saying that it is in fact Quaid who got himself confused with someone else. Interesting. Then Quaid murders everyone. Unsure of how he was able to take out so many armed thugs without a scratch, despite being a 200-pound bodybuilder, Quaid quickly flees home and attempts to tell Laurie about what happened. Laurie, who seems to initially think that he's talking shit, is soon revealed to be a double agent herself, and in fact also tries to kill Quaid, just like Not Quite Danny DeVito and his mates did a moment ago. Also, Michael Ironside's here. Quaid flees and is contacted by a man claiming to be an old friend. Despite having no memory of ever meeting this man, Quaid has little choice but to trust him. The mysterious stranger tells Quaid to put on a makeshift turban, which will somehow block a tracking device in his head. He then leaves Quaid a large suitcase, which, after some trouble, Quaid manages to procure.
Excuse me, ma'am, but this is mine.
I don't see your name on it.
Someone left it for me.
Go find your own bag.
Excuse me, ma'am, but I need it.
Fuck you, you asshole.
After fleeing once again from Michael Ironside and his cronies, who it turns out work for none other than the evil Martian governor, Cohagen, Quaid escapes the bizarrely now explosive animatronic of the Doctor from Star Trek Voyager,
Hope you enjoyed the ride.
and then takes a load off. Searching the case he was given, he discovers several passports, some cash, a strange contraption, several fun-sized Mars bars, and the biggest portable DVD player in the history of human existence. I thought this was supposed to be 2084. So here's where things get complicated. Upon loading up the portable DVD player, Quaid is met by a recorded message from himself. According to, well, his past self, Quaid isn't actually Quaid.
Get ready for the big surprise. You are not you. You're me. No shit.
His name is apparently Hauser, and he is in fact an ex-employee of none other than Mr. Cohagen, who changed sides and joined the Mars resistance movement after discovering the existence of an ancient Martian device that could terraform the planet. He goes on to say that he then had his memory wiped and was given a new identity, that of Douglas Quaid. However, before Quaid can even begin to process this information, Hauser instructs him to use the aforementioned bizarre contraption to remove the tracking chip from his head through his nasal passage in a scene that was revolutionary at the time, but now looks a little dated, I guess. Oh, and also get his ass to Mars. After removing the chip and wasting half a Mars bar to get some rats killed, Quaid flees before Michael Ironside arrives. He then makes his way to Mars as instructed, and after disguising himself as an overweight woman with an exploding head that seems to only work for 2 seconds at customs, finds that Hauser has left him further breadcrumbs to follow after he receives a note from his alternate self instructing him to head to the mutant slum known as Venusville. Venusville is seemingly one of the many areas of Mars which is home to a mutated and partially psychic population that has developed as a byproduct of Cohagen's unclean and industrial air filtration system, as well as the poor living conditions with which any in the slums are subjected. After meeting up with a definitely trustworthy cab driver, who in no way will sell him out later in the movie, Quaid soon meets up with the resistance in Venusville, and a familiar female who already seems to know who he is, or at least who he was. Thinking that he's Hauser and therefore working for Cohagen, the woman, now identified as Melina, sends Quaid packing. After chilling at his hotel for a bit, Quaid is visited by a man named Dr. Edgemar. Eagle-eyed viewers may remember this guy from that episode of Next Generation named Peak Performance. I mean, from Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. I mean, from the advert for Recall that Quaid watched on his commute earlier in the movie. Now, remember when I said earlier that the scene where Quaid is about to get his memories implanted was possibly the most important in the film? Well, for me, at least, this scene is the second most important. So take note, and we'll return to why in a little bit. After assuring Quaid he's unarmed, Dr. Edgemar begins to speak to Quaid about the events that have led up to this point. He tells Quaid that he in fact suffered a schizoid embolism during the procedure at Recall, and that he is now actually living out a fantasy based on the Recall package he opted for, which is taking place entirely within his own mind. According to Edgemar, in reality, Quaid is in fact still back at Recall, and they have sent in an implanted version of the Doctor to try and bring him back to reality. Laurie then arrives and also tries to convince Quaid that Edgemar is telling the truth, assuring Quaid that she is also at his side at Recall in reality. All of this culminates in Edgemar offering Quaid a red pill and telling him that if he takes it, he will awaken from his fantasy. Quaid threatens Edgemar, essentially positing that if it's all a dream, then it won't matter if he kills the Doctor. Edgemar responds that it will make little difference to him, but to Quaid, it would be the difference between returning to reality and descension into complete lunacy. Almost convinced, Quaid initially seems to decide to take the pill, but upon seeing a bead of sweat running down Edgemar's weird little face, he decides that it's a load of shit and shoots him. Cohagen's guards attack almost immediately, and after dispatching them, Melina shows up and fights Laurie. Despite almost winning the encounter and making Quaid hesitate with the whole wife shtick, Laurie tries to deal the killing blow, but is instead shot in the head by Quaid, allowing for one of the film's most hilarious one-liners.
Consider that a divorce.
Fleeing back to Venusville from Michael Ironside and his cronies, who is now super pissed because he was actually Laurie's secret lover. I can't remember if I mentioned that before. Did I? Oh well, it's really only there to build further rivalry between Quaid and Ironside, and also to add more fuel to the fire that most characters surrounding Quaid are not trustworthy. Huh. I guess that was kind of important information. Anyway, back at Venusville, Ironside is hot on Melina and Quaid's tail. Luckily, Vagina Face and his friends are able to help them escape via a super secret passageway, stumping Ironside's efforts for now. After hearing that they are seemingly impossible to find, Cohagen decides to shut off the oxygen to Venusville and the other slums to try and coax them out. Melina and Quaid are then taken to the Resistance's secret HQ, where they meet up with the Resistance leader, Kuato, a weird slimy baby puppet that lives inside the bad guy from Twins. Kuato proceeds to read Quaid's mind and show him the aforementioned ancient alien contraption that can in fact terraform Mars, giving it a breathable atmosphere. However, their romantic date is interrupted once again by Cohagen's goons, who have been tipped off by none other than the definitely trustworthy cab driver Benny. Shocking. Michael Ironside then kills Kuato and takes Quaid and Melina to see Cohagen. Now here's where shit really gets crazy. Cohagen, with the help of a pre-recorded message from Hauser, tells Quaid that his entire persona was a plot thought up by his former self to help expose the leader of the Resistance, Slippy Baby Man, inside the guy from Twins, Kuato, without tipping off Venusville's mutants' inherent psychic abilities. Cohagen then orders that Hauser's persona be returned in place of Quaid's, and also that Melina too have her personality altered to make her more subservient. However, Quaid and Melina are able to escape their shackles and proceed to murder Benny and make their way to the alien terraforming device that Kuato had shown Quaid on their romantic date. After arriving there and partaking in some great action, Michael Ironside gets his arms cut off, Cohagen gets sucked out onto the surface of Mars and dies, and Quaid and Melina almost die in the same way, but are able to activate the machine just in time, saving their lives and liberating the entire planet. The final shot fades up to white as Melina and Quaid embrace on the now red and blue planet's surface. Okay, so I get that overview didn't really do the movie justice, and may have missed a bunch of more nuanced points, but at least it should have reminded you guys what happens if you haven't seen it in a little while. And if you've never seen it, well, what the hell are you doing here? Okay, at this point it's worth noting that Verhoeven's Total Recall is by its very design open to interpretation, and so this section of the video exists more as my personal interpretation or theory of the film's events. Still, having said this, I think that it's a relatively convincing hypothesis, but see what you think. Also, I'm not claiming that this is my personal owned theory, but more one that I subscribe to. So when I first watched Total Recall at far too young an age, I judged it on its surface level. It seemed to me like a great action movie, akin to many that Arnie had been making in the years leading up to it. Such an interpretation is one I also experienced the first time I watched RoboCop and Starship Troopers, again at far too young an age. But as I grew up and began to see its hidden meanings and themes, I also started to realise just how incredible the narrative and method of delivery really is here. It's an enigmatic tale filled with twists and turns that obfuscate the truths hidden behind Verhoeven's signature violence and Arnie's familiar action. As the years went on, I began to question Quaid's tale more and more, having at first taken the story at face value, not listening to those painted throughout its events as evil or villainous. But one clear theme within Verhoeven's Total Recall is trust, or at least the lack of it. Think about it, throughout the movie, it seems Quaid is lied to by his wife, his best friend, Benny, and even his former self. Similarly, the movie begins to make us, the audience, question what we are being shown and told too. So before discussing the themes and what these events represent, it's important to try and contextualize them by trying to unearth the real truth of what happens in this tale. After many years of watching, rewatching, and breaking down this movie frame by frame, as well as researching interviews and theories posted by other fans and critics, I believe I have finally unearthed the reality hidden in its events, for me at least. And it's worth reiterating at this point that many others have come to the similar or even the same conclusion. But in my opinion, the following is what's really going on in Verhoeven's 1990 classic. Strangely, while I was always aware that something seemed off with how the events unfold in Total Recall, as a younger viewer I was never entirely sure why. But as I aged into an old and bitter moron, I realised that the narrator and the narration was indeed extremely unreliable. While the realisation itself was a much slower dawn, the truth about Quaid's journey essentially all began with one scene, the scene at Recall. From the moment Quaid is put to sleep here, I believe that we are no longer seeing reality, but we are instead seeing what is going on in Quaid's head as he exists in a comatose, dreamlike state. Remember when I said that the scene in which Quaid is being subdued was the most important scene in the movie for me? Well, here's why. Firstly, it can be clearly seen that right before, the salesman has sold Quaid a package of events that seem remarkably similar to those that will go on to occur throughout the rest of the movie.
You are a top operative, back under deep cover on your most important mission. People are trying to kill you left and right. You meet this beautiful, exotic woman. I don't want to spoil it for you, Doug, but you rest assured, by the time the trip is over, you get the girl, kill the bad guys, and save the entire planet.
Second, take a look at the images on the screen that scroll through as the team are setting up. They look kind of like the alien artifact at the end of the movie, right? So let's play devil's advocate for a moment and assume that they are. How would Recall know about this if it turned out to be reality, and where would they get those pictures from?
And would you like us to integrate some alien stuff?
Sure, why not? Two-headed monsters?
Don't you keep up with the news? We're doing alien artifacts now.
Thirdly, and most importantly for me, listen to what this tech says when he has thrown the memories they're about to implant.
Ernie,
That's a new one. Blue sky on Mars.
been married long?
That's a new one. Blue skies on Mars. For me, this is the most obvious and blatant clue that the entire rest of the movie after Quaid is put to sleep occurs inside his mind. Think about it. This tech is literally telling the audience the end of the movie, and he would have no way of knowing that this would occur unless it was simply part of the fiction crafted by Recall and being lived out in a comatose state by Quaid. So let's briefly look at how the whole story changes if this is the case. Firstly, Quaid's character shifts from being an action hero, hiding in plain sight from everyone, including himself, to a bored and unfulfilled construction worker who is the victim of a medical procedure gone wrong. If the entire movie up until Quaid is put under at Recall is reality, then instead of some master spy being drawn to Mars to complete some world-saving mission that he knows somewhere deep in his psyche is calling out to be finished, he is in fact a bored and isolated manual labourer who is fixating on Mars as a method of displacing his feelings of unfulfillment. If you watch the movie with this in mind, very quickly other clues and coincidences start to add up. Why would Hauser and Cohagen concoct such a convoluted plot to expose Coato when they were willing to just shut off the air anyway? Wouldn't that have killed him? Why would the mysterious woman that Recall created be real and also be the one who Quaid ends up with? And how would so much of what is foreshadowed come to pass, both up until this scene at Recall and throughout the rest of the movie? Few scenes reinforce this theory more than the second most important sequence in the movie for me, Dr. Edgemar's visit to Mars. Everything about this scene frames Dr. Edgemar as a villain. The way it's shot, the dialogue, the pacing, every little detail makes the audience want to side with Quaid here. But let's consider for a moment the potential reality of the situation. What has Edgemar done to indicate that he is in cahoots with Cohagen up until this point in the movie? The only other time we have seen him is on a public broadcast commercial for Recall, in a public place with no hint of nefarious goings-on. Such framing also makes us feel like Recall are too evil and villainous, but upon re-examining the facts, the worst thing we can accuse them of up until this point is incompetence and malpractice. Such reactions from the audience are intentional and lend a meta quality to the way Total Recall executes on its themes. When you think about a bored manual labourer who lives a boring and unfulfilled life, you don't think of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnie is known for his larger-than-life action movies that made his name in the mid to late 80s, and so it's almost as if your mind is tricked into thinking that's what you're watching. Such meta-construction is true of almost all elements of the movie, and also helps to reinforce the feelings of misunderstanding and isolation that someone in Quaid's position would feel, but more on that in a bit. So let's consider for a moment that everything Edgemar says in this scene is the truth. Suddenly, a lot more of the movie begins to make sense. Up until this point, everything seems to have happened at just the right time for Quaid to escape relatively unscathed and enjoy the ride. But how? How has he kept winning out in these situations? Sure, it could be that he's just that well trained, but wasn't he just a business partner of Cohaagen before all of this? Where did he get that kind of training? Also, what reason would Edgemar have for being here other than this? As far as we know, he has no affiliation to Cohaagen, and the only other time we have seen him in the movie is on a TV commercial for Recall. Finally, regarding Edgemar, it's worth noting that everything he says will come to pass if Quaid shoots him actually happens.
You're having a paranoid episode triggered by acute neurochemical trauma, or that you're really an invincible secret agent from Mars who's the victim of an interplanetary conspiracy to make him think he's a lowly construction worker. It won't make the slightest difference to me, Doug, but the consequences to you would be devastating. In your mind, I'll be dead, and with no one to guide you out, you'll be stuck in permanent psychosis.
Doug, let Dr. Edgemar help you.
The walls of reality will come crashing down. 1 minute, you'll be the savior of the rebel cause, and the next thing you know, you'll be Cohaagen's bosom buddy. You'll even have fantasies about alien civilizations, as you requested, but in the end, back on Earth, you'll be lobotomized.
How could he know all of this? He calls out specific events. The evidence doesn't stop here either. Near the end of the movie, Cohaagen even tells Quaid that he's nothing but a stupid dream.
You're nothing! You're nobody! You're a stupid dream.
And in the final shot, Quaid even says to Melina, "What if this is all a dream?" before they embrace and the screen fades up to white, a known technique in filmmaking for illustrating a dream state or sequence.
I can't believe it. It's like a dream. What's wrong?
I just had a terrible thought. What if this is a dream?
Well, then kiss me quick before you wake up.
Finally, we have the fact that Quaid clearly dreams about Melina at the start of the film, and then she is established as a created persona, whilst Quaid is at Recall. This does confuse the theory a little for me, but the idea that Recall could create a template that Quaid then expanded in his mind using a persona that he had already created in a subconscious dream state is much more plausible than the idea that she actually exists, and it's just a coincidence that Recall made her almost exactly the same during their tests as Quaid was being put under. While this theory seems strong, it's also worth considering other ideas and theories regarding Total Recall's events. After all, Verhoeven has clearly obfuscated the film's true narrative intentionally, and so there are a few absolutes here. Typically speaking, both the fandom and the academic community have placed the film's events into three main categories. The first is the aforementioned theory, that Quaid is in fact in a comatose state, and we are watching his dreams after his first trip to Recall. The second, and one that holds the least plausibility for me, is that the events of the movie should be taken at face value, i.e. this stuff is actually happening, and everything we see should be interpreted as a literal reality. Sure, I guess it could maybe be an elaborate plot by Cohaagen, who has also enlisted Recall to help him, but it seems a little convoluted, right? Still, there is a scene that gives this theory a little more credence, when Quaid speaks to Cohaagen in his office after they're captured, but for me, it's not enough to buy it. Also, for reasons stated previously, and for reasons that I'll get into in the thematic analysis part of this video, I just don't believe it was ever Verhoeven's intention to frame the events of this movie as a concrete reality, despite it working well as an action movie on its own if taken that way. The final theory, and one that I can actually see being viable, is that everything we are seeing after Quaid visits Recall is the memories that are being implanted and that Quaid is actually fine. Essentially, we are just seeing what they implanted play out. While in many ways this idea could work, the reason it doesn't quite hold water for me is all of the aforementioned indicators throughout the movie that something is wrong and that Quaid is dreaming, including the aforementioned scene in which this is expressly laid out to Quaid. Furthermore, if these are just the memories that have been implanted, why do they contain the murder of his wife and best friend? Also, it's worth noting that these are not the only three theories when it comes to this 1990s sci-fi action blockbuster. And while they form the foundation for many others, there continues to be healthy discussions both in academic and fan circles about the truth behind Quaid's story. Regardless, I think at least we can all agree that this is a movie that warrants discussion and contains more depth than it would initially appear to. Strangely, I also think this may have been Verhoeven's intention all along. So, assuming the dream state theory is true, Before Quaid visits Recall, he is a bored, frustrated, and unstimulated manual labourer who, while having achieved a decent living, is clearly yearning for some sort of excitement in his life. Such a stance reinforces his decision later in the movie to reject the idea that all that he is experiencing is make-believe, instead choosing to deny reality and stay in his dream world. But what does this say about Quaid himself and the nature of the American commercial experience, both in 1990 when the movie was first released, and even today? Philosopher and cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker asserted that humans, unlike other sentient beings, develop a connection to the so-called soul by developing into two selves. The first of these is the inner self, which is completely unknowable by anyone other than the individual themselves. This is because it's built of feelings, memories, and interpretations that can never fully be communicated due to the limitations of language and human expression. The second is the projected self, which seeks to forge connections to others and communicate these elements of the inner self despite their inability to ever be fully explained. So if we work under the assumption of this theory being valid for just a moment, we can see a larger than average disconnect between Quaid's projected self and his inner self, to a point where he wishes he was a different person entirely. In many ways, this notion is exemplified in the existence of Hauser, who clearly represents the corporate, sensible side of Quaid, which, as the film progresses, he seeks to destroy completely. The dream in which Quaid chooses to exist becomes the place where he believes the version of himself that only he knows can finally be successfully communicated, not because it's normally possible, but because everyone he interacts with here is a creation of his own mind, and is often also some element of himself manifesting as a persona for him to interact with. Hauser embodies his old life, Melina his desires, Edgemar his sense of reason, and Cohagen the societal pressure to conform to the status quo. All of this is sold to the viewer so subtly and also through so much obfuscation that it can almost be completely unnoticeable. Moreover, the casting continues to reinforce other notions brought by the audience, such as the presence of Schwarzenegger. In all of our minds, he's an unkillable action machine, and so that's the role we project onto him in this story. But what if he was just a normal guy? What if Verhoeven wanted us to be thrown off, but in reality, Quaid is just a normal person who is bored with his life? Of course, the theme of identity is also explored in different ways throughout the movie. For example, the notion of a person being completely defined by their memories is also an interesting theme that is presented throughout, as well as the idea of lying to yourself in order to allow for a happier existence, which is based more around personal desire than reality. However, while we could talk for hours about every one of these themes, time marches on, and before we wrap things up, there is one more theme I'd like to talk about, and it is one that is the staple of Verhoeven's work, especially from the mid-1980s until the mid-1990s. Much like RoboCop before it, and Starship Troopers after, Total Recall is once again a masterclass in selling a critique of American capitalist society to a mass audience disguised as a generic action movie. But while RoboCop would tackle the concept of corporation and its effects on society, and Starship Troopers would examine the corporate militarization and futility of propaganda-driven mass conflict, Total Recall instead investigated the effects of corporate society on the individual. Remember, Quaid is sold these memories by a corporation who advertises what is essentially a better life for a low, low price. Also, Quaid is made to feel insignificant in a society that is constantly selling products to consumers to alleviate such feelings. I mean, just look at all of the advertisements seen in the backgrounds. Finally, Cohagen and his friends are the ruling elite, and classism is rife on Mars, while Quaid positioning himself as the people's champion is one that serves the story arc of many generic action movie from this, or indeed any other era. This notion, once again, enforces the concept of corporate and political greed subjugating the very subjects of any given society. For me at least, Verhoeven's obfuscation of such poignant themes is masterful. Total Recall is a movie that can be enjoyed as what it is, or what it pretends to be, and that is truly an accomplishment. While not all of Verhoeven's work should be held up with the same level of reverence, except Showgirls obviously, it truly can't be understated how amazingly this movie accomplishes a feat that few filmmakers will ever even attempt. Much like RoboCop before it, Total Recall, for me at least, is a masterpiece. And hey, at least they haven't remade this one like they did with Robo.